Hi everyone. If everyone needs a plant, you should talk to me. So my title is actually a bit simpler than that. I'm just looking at mountain pine beetles in post-burn lodgepole pine forests. I'm not actually evaluating tree fitness. That was an older title. So as Keith mentioned, I'm under the supervision of Nadir Urbagan at the UofA, and we're also collaborating with Jane Park from Parks Canada. So just before I get started, I wanted to get the acknowledgements out of the way. I really want to acknowledge the Foothills Research Institute and especially Don Podlubny. I guess he's not here today, but he helped me a lot at the beginning of this project, and I couldn't have done it without him. There are a lot of people to acknowledge from Alberta Parks, Alberta SRD, Parks Canada, CFS, and of course many amazing assistants and volunteers. You can see that I forced them to do jumping pictures here in the field. And of course all my funding sources. Right, so I'm not really going to go into what the mountain pine beetle is, as everyone knows. We have a few management options to slow its spread or to stop it from spreading across Canada. And these mostly involve logging and fire. So we can cut or burn individual affected trees, which is a common practice. We can cut or burn unaffected trees to create boundaries or inhospitable areas for the mountain pine beetle. Or we can do this to heterogenize the landscape, so get rid of those homogeneous old lodgepole pines. Sometimes fire is better than logging. This is because it mimics natural disturbances and can allow natural recolonization of plants and animals. But most importantly, in parks such as Banff or Kootenay National Parks in Canada, we can't log, so management options are limited to fire sometimes. But, as we all know, fire leaves these live but partially burnt trees behind. It's never a clear border between burned and unburned trees. And we do know that at endemic populations, at least, mountain pine beetles are mostly found in stressed trees because they don't have the numbers to overwhelm healthy trees. And so we thought that perhaps these physiologically stressed trees that are left behind after a fire might also be attractive to the mountain pine beetle. There are some conflicting results, and I thought this was kind of an amusing picture. Even this beetle couldn't decide. This was on one tree. You can see the healthy part of the tree and the burned side. I don't know if it's that visible on that screen, but he kind of attacked, she kind of attacked right in the middle of that, so she couldn't even decide. So one of the main studies back in 2004 in Banff was done by Elkin and Reed, and they showed that mountain pine beetles don't prefer burnt trees. This was done on a small scale. They torched individual trees. More recently, last year, Powell et al. In Ken Raffa's lab in Yellowstone found that mountain pine beetles do in fact prefer burnt trees. So there seems to be a disconnect. There are other studies in there as well, but there are conflicting results. So we wondered what is happening here in Alberta, especially in southern Alberta where I set up my sites, and especially over the long term, because this 2011 study was done just 1 year after fire. So the overall objective, just to get you on track, is to determine whether burned lodgepole pine stands have the potential to become ecological sinks or sources for mountain pine beetle populations in Alberta. I have three main long-term sites: Saskatchewan Crossing, which is partly in Banff, the Yahatinda Ranch, which is just outside Banff, and Mount Nestor, which is partly in Banff and partly in Spray Valley Provincial Park. Just to give you a really quick overview of the methods, there are a lot more details associated with this, so let me know if you have any questions. But I set up 15 10 by 10 meter plots per fire injury class at each of those sites. I had 3 fire injury classes: unburned, low, and moderate. Low, just to get a rough idea, is between 1 and about 20% bull char, so the percent of the trunk that's burned. Moderate is 21 to about 40%. Anything higher than that in the high category was dead, so I didn't really include that high category in these analyses. So that meant about 135 plots in total. because those categories are kind of at a rough scale, I also wanted to look at individual fire injury indices because the beetles might hone in on these individual trees as opposed to the areas. So I looked at bole char for each tree. This is, again, the percent of the trunk that was burned. Bole char height, how high that char got on the trunk. And percent ground char, so how much of the duff around the tree was burned. So just before I get started on these results, I'd just like to say that I'm in my third year of my PhD, and so I have another field season coming up, so all of this data is not final, so stay tuned for next year. So I'd like to give you an example of what I found for the overall trend at Mount Nestor. On the y-axis, we have the proportion of colonized trees. This is a mean per plot. On the x-axis, we have year. The fires occurred in the spring of 2009, so there was a flight period in 2009 where they were able to go and attack trees. You can see that they attacked more moderately burnt trees than lightly burnt trees and unburnt trees, and overall more attacks in the burn than outside. In 2010, the same trend, although you can see that the numbers of attacks have decreased. In 2011, the same thing occurs again. So preliminarily, I see an ecological sink associated with this graph, although I can't really say that yet. I have to look at all of my sites. For my individual fire injury data, it does seem to predict mountain pine beetle colonization, although which fire injury indices actually predict this change from year to year. In 2009, it seems that bole char height, and duff char all predict mountain pine beetle colonization. In 2010, duff char is no longer important, and in 2011, none of those are predictors anymore. And I think this probably has something to do with the fact that the trees they like, those moderately burnt trees, are dying off after the fire, and preference is no longer really noticeable. Just like to give you an example of one of these predictors, bole char. So on the y-axis we have probability of mountain pine beetle colonization, and on the x-axis we have bole char, so percent bole char. And these were done with logistic regression, so you're going to see models. So the year of the fire in 2009, the line is the model of probability of mountain pine beetle colonization. Don't worry too much about the dots. You can see that at about 45% bole char, you're going to get there's about 50 to 100% probability of mountain pine beetle colonization after you hit that 45% bole char. In 2010, if you look again at that 45% bole char, now we have almost 100% probability of colonization. And then in 2011, like I was saying, bole char is no longer a significant predictor. So there's something really interesting going on here that I haven't really teased out yet. So just to recap really quickly, this is the same graph I showed you earlier. Two questions come out from this graph to me. One is, why do mountain pine beetles colonize burnt trees more often? Because you could see that that was the trend every year. And two is, why is the mountain pine beetle population decreasing in the burned area over time? I say population in quotations because I didn't really track the population. So what I should be saying is, why is the number of attacks decreasing over the years? So firstly, I thought that reproduction might have something to do with why they're attacking those burnt trees more often. Maybe they're better able to reproduce in those trees. And to test this, I used phloem sandwiches. So what we did here was peel phloem off a bolt and stick it between two pieces of plexiglass, and then introduce a pair of mating bark beetles at the bottom there. I guess I should use this. Yeah, so we had a pair of mating bark beetles in here, and they went this way, they came back down, and went back up again in this one. Don't know why they did that. So I actually didn't get enough samples that worked to give me a lot of significant results, but one of the things that I found was that maternal gallery length on the y-axis was significantly different between the moderately burnt trees and the low and unburned. And I think that one of the reasons this is happening is that there might be some difference in nitrogen in the phloem, and also perhaps there are some differences in defensive chemicals that are allowing these beetles to reproduce or not. And so these are future experiments for this summer. The second question was, why is the mountain pine beetle population decreasing in the burned area? And the angle I wanted to take here was the subcortical community. There are a lot of insects associated with the underbark of trees, of lodgepole pine trees specifically. These are just some of them. These three here, Ips beetles, Scolytus beetles, and ambrosia beetles are competitors. We've got clarid beetles that are predators, parasitoids, all sorts of things. These flies are also predators, and this is a wood borer competitor. So I think that there probably is something happening in the burn with all of this, with all of these different insect species. We can't just assume that just the mountain pine beetle is changing between the burn and unburn. So what I did here was had a bunch of traps out in all of my different sites. I had passive flight intercept traps. They're not absolutely passive because they're still black, but they're not baited. I had landing rate traps and emergence traps. This one was on a fallen tree, but we had them on standing trees as well. And I'm also rearing all sorts of insects from these logs in the growth chamber at the school, just so I can make sure that I'm getting everything in the field that I should be getting, that I'm not biased and not able to collect parasitoids or something like that. So I'd just like to show you a brief example. I don't have all of this data analyzed, but I do have the direct competitors analyzed. So these are all bark beetles in the subfamily Scolytinae, and these are all numbers from flight intercept traps, so those big ones. In 2010, you can see that we had a fairly low number of beetles that were caught. This is because the traps aren't baited. But we can still see a trend. There seem to be more beetles in the burn than outside, although it's not statistically significant in 2010. However, in 2011, the number goes up quite a bit, and the trend is the same, and now it's statistically significant. So you can see that there are more bark beetle competitors in the burn than there are in the surrounding healthy areas. And this coincides with that decrease that I showed you earlier of the mountain pine beetle attacks in the burned area. So I haven't analyzed these directly with the other data, but I do think that this is probably related somehow, because mountain pine beetles are not known to be very good competitors. So what are some of the management implications for this? I hope that by the end of this project I'm able to answer the question of whether it even matters that we take mountain pine beetles into consideration when we're prescribing burns. And if it does, I hope to be able to suggest the kinds of trees that should be removed following a burn. For example, ones that were on that model that I showed of the 45% bole char and that sort of thing. And I'd just like to say a quick thank you to this SOD crew that helped me a lot last year.